Okay, so thanks everyone for enduring the last 2 days. It's been super fun for us organizers to see all of this come together, and of course, this is hopefully going to be the first of you know, several iterations. And we look forward to also your feedback to, figuring out how we can do this better in coming years. So please send us that, any feedback that you have, positive, negative, etc. So it's my pleasure to chair this last session, and this is a book symposium, for Louise's new book. I don't think I need to introduce Louise in too much detail, or indeed our illustrious panel, but I'll do so very quickly so that we can hand over. Louise Tillin is a professor of politics at the King's India Institute. Her research interests span federalism, democracy, territorial politics in India, and the history and politics of social policy design and implementation. And her new book is entitled Making India Work from Cambridge University Press. Mekhala Krishnamurthy, our first, or I don't know, you guys can decide what order you want to go in. Mekhala is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University, and she's also a senior fellow at CPR in New Delhi, and a non-resident scholar at CASI and Penn. I'm going to skip ahead. Reetika is a professor of economics at IIT Delhi, and she's scratched out the rest, so I can't read that. And Dipa was introduced yesterday. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Louise. Louise has 20 minutes, which is in real time, not in fake time. And then we'll have 15 minutes for each presenter before asking Louise then to respond to that, and then opening it up to the panel. So away you go, Louise.
Thank you ever so much, Anush. And let me just say what a hard act it is to come at the end of this conference, which has been hugely stimulating. And just to reiterate, thanks to Anush and to Sonal for all that you've done to put it together. We've been meeting in some form since 2013 in different configurations around a conference on India's political economy. And it's so exciting that MPEI have agreed to take this forward and make it an ongoing concern. And the last 3 days have been terrifically varied, I think, in the approaches that we've engaged with to political economy, from industrial policy, macroeconomics, social structures of accumulation, to architectural history, and so much more. So I'm certainly buzzing with ideas, and thank you to you all for your part in this. This book, which, as Anush said, I have given myself a hard stop of 20 minutes to talk about, is the product of about 10 years of thinking and research and writing. And it is almost impossible, actually, to tell you about it in such a short amount of time. But I'm going to try and do that, and then turn to this amazing dream team of discussants to help tease out, hopefully, some of the themes therein. I think there's lots in the book that speaks to many of the themes that we've been addressing in this conference, from India's stalled structural transformation, from the capital-intensive nature of growth and its implications for most Indians who labour outside the formal sector, and the new forms, or not so new forms, as the book would suggest, of compensatory welfarism that have become essential to the sustainability of India's growth model. And as the book shows, I think, that those dilemmas are not simply contemporary dilemmas. They have shaped thinking about welfare over the much longer durée. So what does the book try to do? In a nutshell, I seek in the book to tell the story of the development of India's welfare regime over the last century, from the interwar period from the 1920s up to the present. I do so because for all of the brilliant studies we have of India's political economy historically, social policy is rather curiously absent in those accounts. We have some of the doyens of the field here with us. But if anything, what I was inspired to do with this book was to attempt something like Francine Frankel's India's Political Economy, but for India's welfare regime. Or for those of you who know some of the wider literature on social policy, something like Protecting Soldiers and Mothers does for US social policy, really to try and think about what goes for welfare in India in a more comprehensive way, than much existing literature does, and to try and connect that to historical thinking about the design and shaping of welfare states across the globe. So, many of you will be familiar with some of the rich scholarship that does exist on what I would describe as the pockets of social democratic exceptionalism in certain regions of India, of a very rich literature and set of civil society mobilization around rights-based approaches to welfare, particularly in the early 2000s, and of course many, many studies of the proliferation of individual schemes. But these don't add up to a summative account which situates all of this that goes for welfare within a larger and pan-India trajectory. And this, I felt, especially as I was starting to work on, and much of my work before I began the book, and even while I've been writing the book, has been focused on explaining the regional politics of welfare. So the existence of subnational welfare regimes, work that grew out particularly of the rights-based era and the appropriation of rights-based policies and their implementation, differential implementation across states. As I got deeper into that work, I was both became aware that of the absence of this longer historical literature, but also that in comparative terms, this was quite peculiar as well. There is now a wider literature which shows us that not only the traditional post-war welfare states in Europe take distinctive forms, but that forms of social policy intervention also cluster in distinctive ways across the global south, that in ways that reflect the divergent histories of different regions within the global south. So this book really seeks to situate India within that wider scholarship. For all that I've said, this absence is glaring from previous work. And curious, I think there are actually very good reasons why welfarism has been relatively neglected historically. One of those, I think, the most obvious reason was the relegation of social and economic rights to the directive principles of the Indian Constitution at a founding moment. And in a sense, that act has been interpreted as downgrading the significance of welfare in India's post-independence trajectory. And of course, the assumption I think that we see in much political economy literature is that it's difficult to understand, to study something like social policy because perhaps there wasn't a purposive approach to social policy because of the capture of the state by particular interest groups, and the preeminence of clientelism in what Kanchan Chandra notably described as a patronage democracy. So I think all of these things have constrained our imaginative and historical horizons for understanding the welfare state in India. So what does the book seek to do? And I should say, the book, for which there are leaflets here at the front but no physical copies, will materialise next month, I'm told. So I'll hopefully do a bit of promo and send this perhaps out to the group here with the details of the book when it comes out. There will be an Indian edition. But the title of the book, Making India Work, has two particular meanings. The first meaning is to point to the perennial problem of jobless growth in a labour-abundant economy, and to say that this has shaped India's approach to thinking about social policy and designing social policy over the much longer term. So the second part of the book, which I'll show you in a minute, is entitled Putting Indians to Work. And I suggest that the dilemma of how to put Indians to work has been an abiding concern for policymakers since independence. It's been an abiding concern of this conference over the last few days as well. So that's the first meaning of the title. The second is to say that welfare policies have also been integral to making India work in a quite different way, both as a national economy, but also as a national polity. And I show that in two ways in the book. The first, and this really relates to the first part of 3 in the book, relates to the way in which the early design of social policy, and here I'm looking at the development of the nascent social security architecture for what we now know as formal sector workers, and we know them partly as formal sector workers by virtue of the design of social security for that sector. This came to define the contours of the organised and unorganised sectors. That early experience of social policy development in the first half of the 20th century was shaped by an effort to regulate inter-regional economic competition, essentially to set a floor on labour market competition across British provinces and between British provinces and princely states on the eve of India's independence, and to avoid a so-called race to the bottom in labour conditions. So that's the building the national economy part of the story. But also the book demonstrates that welfare policies have been intimately shaped and have helped to shape the way that electoral competition within India's consolidating democracy has crystallized. And that particularly from the 1980s onwards, or in fact, slightly earlier than that, 1970s onwards, welfare policies have been expanded due to the emergence and strengthening of multi-level competition within that consolidating democracy. So that's the kind of the twofold play on words that the title conjures up. Just to give a little snapshot, I can't talk about each of the chapters in detail, but just to give a little snapshot of the content of the book. So it's split into three parts. The first part, building a national economy, regulating internal competition, is motivated by what became for me one of my biggest preoccupations in researching this book, which I started to think, is this just too arcane to hinge a book around, but was to understand why India's Constituent Assembly, while sitting as the Legislative Assembly, even before the promulgation of the Constitution, had legislated on sickness insurance for industrial workers. And when that happened, the votaries, the proponents of sickness insurance, of whom there were many, saw it as the kernel, the beginning of a proto-welfare state for industrial workers in India might look like. So the first two chapters in the book chart how this social insurance-led model for an imagined future Indian welfare state took shape in the late colonial period. This is a period in which the debates in India are influenced by a number of things, including growing industrial action in colonial Bombay and other major industrial centres in colonial India, but also India's membership of the then new International Labour Organization, where many of these debates around social insurance were starting to take shape. And any resolution that was passed by the International Labour Organization also had to be discussed in India. And by virtue of being included in the ILO, this also prompted the creation of new apex bodies for industry. FICCI, for instance, was established partly in order to give Indian employers a voice at the International Labour Organization, international labour conferences, but also gave a voice to a particular segment of labour representatives, of whom N.M. Joshi in Bombay played a particularly important role in starting to engage with some of these ideas around social insurance and their applicability in India. What I do in this part of the book, and this involved a lot of archival research, is to show that contrary to some of the common assumptions that are often made about the origins of social security provisions for formal sector workers in India, and also more generally the way that the political evolution of welfare states is understood in much of the literature on Europe, is to say that social insurance in the Indian context was not introduced in response to to the power of organised labour. So this social insurance was not something that Marxist labour mobilisers were demanding in factory strikes, for instance, but this was something that both more moderate labour leaders, provincial administrators, and as I show, to some extent, industrialists were interested in understanding better as a potential response to ways of stabilizing the factory workforce in the 1930s. This is the time of the report of the Royal Commission on Labour in India. And that I then show that by the eve of the Second World War, there were growing demands from industry, particularly industry based in Bombay, for the colonial government, the government of India, to convene national conferences on questions of labour in order to coordinate labour policy across India, in order that employers in Bombay, where labour costs were higher than many of the newer centres of the textile industry in many other parts of the country, to avoid employers being undercut in Bombay by provinces that didn't introduce these forms of labour provision. And this is something that Dr. Ambedkar, who becomes a member for Labour on the Viceroy's Executive Council during the Second World War, that Ambedkar himself pushes through. And there's lots of fascinating footnotes to that part of the story, but I'm going to move on to part 2 of the book. So part 2 of the book picks up the story from independence onwards. And it shows that very quickly, post-independence, a rather different logic starts to take hold of thinking about what kind of welfare state India should build. And I show that the debates that crystallise in the second 5-year plan, led in particular by the thinking of Mahalanobis and Nehru, focus on the public investment in the low employment, high productivity and capital-intensive forms of industrialisation, which deliberately curtail labour-intensive industrialisation. And they do this, and there's decent amount of writing by Mahalanobis who directly engages with the implications for the forms of social insurance that have already been introduced by this stage. But the decision really is to create an island of protected labour in the capital-intensive sector and a much larger reserve army of labourers labouring in lower productivity sectors who were not to be covered by the forms of sickness insurance and provident fund cover that had by this point been legislated on for organised sector workers. And there are parallel debates that then take place. A set of debates that see the need to continue the process of developing social insurance for the industrial sector, so to build on sickness insurance and provident funds, in particular to think about this question of what do you do about unemployment insurance, and could India afford to have a form of unemployment insurance? This is a debate that is eventually unresolved, left unresolved by the mid-1960s, and instead what you see are the erection of protections against retrenchment. So the origins of that amendment to the Industrial Disputes Act, which has obviously been the bane of labour law reformers post-liberalisation, the origins of those protections against retrenchment, I show, lie in the failure to agree what a form of contributory unemployment insurance might look like for the industrial sector in this period. Instead, the Nehruvian so-called welfare state focused on activating what I describe, not unique to me, describe as a duty to work. So rather than a right to work, we have the assertion of a duty to work. And this gives way by the early 1970s to the acknowledgement of the need to then focus on what do you do in terms of social security for the rural poor, who, in the absence of mass employment industrialisation in the organised sector and in the wake of the Green Revolution, are struggling in multiple dimensions. The third part of the book turns to the story post-liberalisation, and to show really that the 1990s forced a reckoning with what I describe as the contradictory trajectories of planning, of welfare in the planning era. In the first place, the truncated introduction of social insurance had failed to resolve this question of what to do about unemployment, and had instead led to stringent protections against retrenchment. This meant that in the early phases of liberalisation, the need or the attempt to design an exit policy for organised labour in sections of industry that were slated for privatisation or the dismantling of PSUs, that this became a very key contention. It was the first element of the reform package that Manmohan Singh had to roll back on in 1992. And in the second place, the fiscal burden of the kind of rural policy interventions that had built slowly through the 1970s and 1980s had helped to create growth, particularly in the rural economy, but had led the macroeconomy to the brink of crisis. So I chart this process. I engage with some newly declassified World Bank archival material that shows how India renegotiated the terms of its social safety net adjustment loan in order to maintain its existing trajectory of social policy architecture in the rural sector, rather than treating economic liberalisation as a radical break in the design of welfare. And then I show how the extension of electoral competition between national parties and regional parties helped to promote the expansion of what we now describe as direct benefits, the first kinds of direct benefit transfer, forms of social assistance, non-contributory, tax-financed forms of social benefit to so-called labour market outsiders, so to the unorganised, informal sector. There's lots more. That's a real snapshot of what's in the book. This shows you just the breakdown of the chapters. And this gives you just a sense of the sources that I've been working with, both in India, in Delhi, in the National Archives, and what used to be called Krishnamurthy, in some state archives, in the UK, looking at India Office records, looking also at the private papers of William Beveridge. Some of you may be familiar with the Beveridge report in the UK. There's another interesting episode in which Ambedkar tries to bring Beveridge to India to do a Beveridge report for India. So I document all of that. But I've also worked with World Bank archives, digital archives of the ILO, the India Office of the International Labour Organization, and much more. Much more than I can say here, but I think the key point really to take away is that India's welfare policies today have not been produced in a historical vacuum. There's been a much longer history of debate about the nature and size of state intervention in social policy, also shaped by the nature of policy competition between the centre and the states. And I hope, as I've given you some flavour today, the decisions about social policy have also played a very important role in the wider shape and regulation and definition of the Indian economy. So let me pause there, hopefully within my 20 minutes.
Congratulations, Louise, on this really expansive, it covers too many things. I'm not trying to, she did a great job in summarizing the book, but there's so much more in it. Why I'm going first is because, like we saw, there are these three parts, and we are broadly focusing, I think, on different parts of the book. But I'm starting with the earliest part, but that's not where I'll be sticking, really. But taking off on the discussion on the earliest part in social insurance and looking at current issues and debates around welfare. Like I said, and I think you kind of succeeded in what you set out to do, which is to put this kind of long, broad history of the welfare regime and what we have today, where is it really coming from? And just as there can't be one India story on anything when it comes to welfare, also we know that it can't be, and you've yourself written about it earlier. But at the same time, I think it comes out quite clearly in this book that there's some things we are stuck with because they came at a time that they did. And and then of course it's developed over it. So the book goes over the 3 periods that Louise talked about, which I won't repeat. But so what I'm trying to do is to take some ideas from the book and discuss how the questions that came up in my mind relating to what I'm doing currently, and some questions that are coming up right now. So one of the first, a large part in the beginning is spent on how the ESI came about, the Employee State Insurance Corporation and Scheme, and the Act. And that was the first social protection measure to be passed in post-independent India, 1948. And it had a history of the pre-independence mobilization, as well as how Louise shows us that it was not only the pressure from the labor unions, which is what is the sort of popular imagination of where this came from, but also that this was really in the interest of the industrialists, particularly in Bombay, where they were facing this pressure, but there was also the pressure for having a national legislation on social protection so that there is no race to the bottom, if I got it right. So it was interesting for me to see this origin of ESI and how that sort of now kind of helps me understand better some of the current issues facing ESI, because the ESI continues to be one of the most comprehensive social security legislations and programs that we have in our country, starting with the same limitation that Louise discusses, that this was very much, however, limited only to workers in the formal sector, which is what it still continues to be. But still, it is quite substantive. So the current coverage is about 3.5 crore beneficiaries, and including their families, it's about 13 crore, I think, people who are covered under the ESI. So it's almost about 10% of the population who are covered by this act, which gives them, there's a lot of discussion on the sickness benefit in the book, but the major part of ESI which is currently functioning is the health insurance part of it, which is where the ESI runs hospitals and dispensaries, and it's expanding in various ways. How is that linking to the earlier discussion? One, of course, the coverage is still low, but I think one of the interesting contrasts is that even if the ESI came up in a situation where the industrialists were also for it, currently where there is a discussion going on in ESI and expanding the ESI, because this is a sort of semi-functioning system compared to the public health system, there's currently a lot of discussion on expanding the ESI to the unorganized sector workers. And one sector where clearly there is now some legislation, although rules have not been formed, where this is being seen as the way out is the gig worker, platform-based workers, where there is a push to say that these workers should also be included in the ESI, and it is the employers who are very strongly resisting this sort of thing. And the arguments, of course, behind the resistance is saying that they are not employers and they're partners and so on. But that this whole debate of employer responsibility, and the book also talks about how even then when there was the Royal Labour Commission and when they were discussing bringing up this legislation, on the one side, while the industrialists were for a national legislation, they were also making a point, which you find in the archival work, that the state must also have a role to play in this, that it should not be only contributions by the employer and employees. And that is exactly the same debate that's going on right now in the context of gig workers, that where the platforms are saying that we are willing to participate in this, but the state needs to put in their money as well. So I thought that was an interesting thing. Another aspect, which for me explained something that I've been trying to understand with the ESI, is where you locate it. Because right now I think it's about more than 90% of ESI funds are spent on health benefits. And in many states, the ESI comes under the health ministry. And in some states, it comes under the labor ministry. And centrally, there is an employee state insurance corporation whose, when you look at it, it is a corporation. And their primary concern is more, their clients are the employers because they are making the bigger share of the contribution. So the way the ESIC is oriented is to manage that money that they've collected. And therefore, you now have a situation where you have this huge unspent amount while you don't have enough hospitals and dispensaries and so on. So again, it fits into this whole larger thing of how it came about and that it was industrialists who wanted it. And even now, when you're looking at ESIC, it seems like it's functioning more for the employer to say that they're doing something on social protection than towards actually providing services. So this whole history of the ESI, also something that's not discussed in the book explicitly, but I thought also links to one broader question related to the welfare regime that currently, particularly in the context of health, that is being discussed on, or even maternity entitlements, on how do we look at welfare. Do we locate it in the space of workers' rights or in the space of universal rights as citizens? And that makes a difference to the kind of mechanisms that get put in place, legislatively as well as programmatically. So if it is in the worker space, then there is huge, and because the labor market, and we've been talking about this for the last 2 years, 2 days, is that because the labor, and 2 decades maybe, but because the labor market has not really emerged the way it was imagined. I mean, the imagination is that everybody would become a formal factory worker and therefore be eligible for an ESI. That's clearly not happened and not happening very soon. Definitely not happened for women in this country. So if all these rights remain only as workers' rights and worker defined as somebody working for an employer, and then there is this employer-employee contribution, there is this whole exclusion that happens. There is this other space of universal rights that many of us have been talking about. Also right to health, education, social protection, and pensions, and all of this, they overlap. Between the ESI kind of system or state provided. And this is a tricky area, and that continues to be in debate. And I thought it relates to that as well, same as maternity benefits. And some of the archival material, it's quite fascinating to see how things emerged. For example, I was quite surprised to see that maternity benefits was the first thing that was ever introduced in India as a labor right. India has not yet ratified the ILO Convention on Maternity Protection. The current Indian Maternity Benefit Act covers only 5% of women in India, but this was the first entitlement to be introduced. So there's so many such little anecdotes which are quite interesting throughout the book. Another thing which I was not very familiar, it's a whole area of literature that I was not familiar with, but again, I thought it was quite interesting in this early part of the book, was this whole literature which says that it is, the kind of welfare regime is linked to the economic model, and that it is, when it is import substitution and industrialization, then it's more this sort of labor rights. And the East Asian models had more focus on human capital, and therefore probably they had education, health, and we didn't. And Louise shows that even before ISI was adopted, it was the political economy of the way, particularly cotton industry emerged, that resulted in this, which again I thought was a useful history to present. But that also poses the question for me on, is it also reverse, that because we did not do human capital, that that kind of industrialization or that kind of growth did not take up? So that it's both ways. That how do we look at that reverse causality of not investing in people, particularly in terms of education and health, and what that means for growth itself? 5 minutes more? Perfect. So that's, again, one of those questions for further investigation, particularly in the current times. One area where I felt, of course, it's already quite comprehensive and one has to choose what you can focus on in different periods, but I did feel that, or an area one needs to definitely, or a complementary book that needs to come out to this, is maybe more a deeper analysis of why did health education not happen? Beyond, of course, it was in the directive principles, it was passed on to the states, and there was already this sort of huge labor legislation direction that we seem to be taking. But somewhere I felt we need to think about this a little bit more. two things of why I'm saying this. One is, of course, there was this whole ESI, but the state was really, and that continues to be, the state has only took on the responsibility of managing that system, has never made any contribution otherwise and continues to not make a contribution. And that is what they're now trying to do for the unorganized sector as well. So the funds logic is not really convincing because it's not as if you were using money on anything else either. And second, Kale already mentioned, the kind of work that Myron Weiner's on child and law in India, which discusses why maybe that investment in primary education did not happen. We probably need to look at why investment in primary health did not happen also from that kind of a political economy lens. There is a lot of analysis on family planning, vertical programs, and how that took over the health system. But given that there was the Bhore Committee and there was this Beveridge report, why is it that that is not what we learned for the health system? And what started off as sickness benefit is the main functioning health system that we have today. Although the coverage is small, it's still at least functioning. So that, I think, is an important question. And that becomes even more relevant when we start looking at, which you do, much less in this book, but more in earlier work as well, is looking at the subnational stories. And here Tamil Nadu definitely stands out, where, again, without going into the details of Tamil Nadu, or even Kerala, that there are states in the country which have done not just these kind of protective measures, but also have done health and education. Maybe not as well as they should do it, but definitely much more than others have done. And one could see a link between the kind of economies that are going on there right now from other states. So that is one area I felt that if we are discussing welfare regime in India, requires some more kind of digging into. And I was recently reading this very fascinating report on, there was a subcommittee on women in the planned economy as part of the National Planning Committee process in 1938. And just this subcommittee report in 1938 is talking about maternity entitlements not being the employer's responsibility because that prevents them from employing women. So the state should take over. They're talking about the right to leisure for women. They are talking about universal health care and so on. So even these things existed, at least in the realm of ideas. And somehow some things continued and the others are forgotten. So what is it? That is one area I felt could do with some more investigation. The second, I think, area, again, particularly in the subnational stories, but also overall, is that when we're looking at the and that's something like what Myron Weiner's work does, is to look at the role of social inequalities and how that influenced the welfare policy as well. So caste, of course, but also gender. And when I say gender, I don't mean only in the usual way in which it is done, at least in the economics literature, of if the mother is healthy, the child is healthy, and mother is educated, child is educated. But in a broader sense of if women have a voice publicly, if women are part of your target audience in political mobilization, then what is the kind of social policy that comes out of that? And there is some work on this in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. But I think that's, again, quite relevant even in the current times when we have all these cash transfer schemes coming up in the name of capturing women's votes and recognizing women's work within the house and so on. 2 more points? 30 seconds? Yeah. So one is to do with also that these 2 days, I'm very glad that this discussion is happening as part of this conference, because this tendency that there is that economic development is the core area and then welfare happens in the side. I think the book doesn't state that upfront, but is sort of countering that also somewhere. So thank you. And I think we need to do much more of that. Like when we were discussing Tamil Nadu industrial policy yesterday, is it a coincidence that Tamil Nadu also happens to be the state we discuss when we discuss social policy? So finally, to conclude, congratulations, great work. Just thinking of what I've said, a lot of things of what else, but 2 immediate things. One would be, and you do mention it in the conclusion, this whole cash transfer thing that's going on right now, the wave of cash transfers. How we even understand that in this kind of a framework would be a big question. And the second, of course, your question of putting Indians to work remains a question. And I think if we bring in welfare and delivery of welfare in it, we probably have answers that the economists have not yet got to. Thank you.
So let me first just start by congratulating Anush and Sonal and the whole NP-EI team. I think there's been some discussion about new and old, and I think this conference is a perfect example of what I think you mean by new, which is you bring something back, but do it differently also. So it's a return to an older conference and format, but with many new elements, and I think that's the inspiration of the initiative. So, huge congratulations to you guys and to all the organizers of the conference, and then big congratulations to Louise on the book, in addition to organizing this and bringing it back as well. I mean, it's just... it's great. But it's really just a huge pleasure to be here, and it's a huge privilege always to be on a panel with Reetika and Dipa. They're like little senior, and I used to be very nervous whenever I had to speak in front of them. No, very seriously, very nervous. And now I'm glad that they're behind me, and so I will not look at them while I make these comments. I think, Louise, it's such a great contribution. And one of the things, I started teaching the welfare state recently, and it's so happy to have Andalib's book with, the Bengali and Rahman book that came out last year, and then yours, because actually when you think about teaching the Indian welfare state, a lot of the literature that comes from India typically just says we don't have one, or it's not the usual one, and behaves as if it's an exception, which is the classic kind of Indian exceptionalist literature also. And I think what both of these does, put it back into a comparative conversation, but also treat it fully in its context and with its complexity. So it's really exciting to have both of these books out, and at least this time I would have read them before teaching them. So that's very exciting too. But also I think this is, one of the great contributions of the book. I think the range of archival materials that you've picked on is just extraordinary, but also that, I think that you go beyond interests, right? And that you make this point early in the introduction, that while it's very important to pay attention, and of course, when you actually start looking at the history of ideas, their evolution, the implementation, the debates, you also see these contradictory sort of relationships, these new coalitions, different kinds of people coming together, conjuncture at which certain kinds of changes occur, and of course the subnational, which I think we are also used to reading your work for. But in this book, perhaps the states aren't at the center of the work as much as in some of your other work, but you never lose sight of them, that there is a subnational story, and that often it's the relationship between center, state, and union, and the kinds of tensions and negotiations, even innovations that come from the conflict between, center and state. And this is very interesting because, in the history of, we were talking about Madhya Pradesh and, procurement, one of the old stories of procurement, we were discussing Shivraj Singh Chauhan, was, Sharad Pawar saying, well, you're a wheat producing state, why don't you procure? In a planning commission meeting at that time, and then there was, a movement towards it. So I think there's so many histories that we miss out on in terms of what actually produces that moment, and I think that comes through in across the sweep of this century. I thought the point I would focus a little bit on is actually part two, beginning with part two, and I think this is the point about economy and welfare, and actually trying to think about the actually existing Indian economy. And I think you use the word commodification and decommodification of labor to think about this approach to welfare and the relationship between how much labor is commodified or decommodified and protection, which is really, really interesting. But in this course that I've been teaching, we begin by reading these two books. So there's one, Chris Renwick's Bread for All, which is a history of the welfare state in the UK, right? And it's interesting because it is about bread for all, it's beverage, it's this kind of looking at the evolution of the welfare state in England. And then there's James Ferguson's Give a Man a Fish, right? And one of the things Ferguson is saying is, how did the parable go from, give a man a fish not being the ideal to give a man a fish actually becoming the consensus? Almost a political consensus that it used to be give a man a fish and you're only solving the problem temporarily, to actually give a man a fish being the issue. And his answer in some ways is that it has to do with politicians, at least, having given up on jobs, having given up on the idea that actually, so he says the 20th century was the century of laboring man. It was building the welfare state on the basis of employment. And the 21st century will be one where we build social protection and welfare, but not on the assumption that there will be such a thing as good jobs. That even if you teach a man to fish, there may be no fish out there on the one hand, or they may not have the implements to actually fish. So people are giving up on the second, teach a man to fish story, and actually moving towards this, and that we need to pay more attention to this. And so it's very interesting in the Indian experience to think about where did we land between this bread for all, building it on employment, to today and the cash transfers, which in some senses are arriving at an understanding that maybe the best way is to actually do direct transfers and not assume that people would get jobs. And what I found really interesting in part 2 was your discussion of not so much of what were the social protection schemes, but the welfare approach to the Indian economy, which was an overwhelmingly agrarian and informal economy. Right? So, I mean, you mentioned the beverage for India, and I found it really interesting. So just for everybody who wants a little story from the book, but I mean, it was Ambedkar himself who wanted to invite him, but then who rescinded this invitation when beverage wanted to do more than just formal sector industrial workers, right? I mean, he wanted to study all Indians. He wanted to do a report on welfare for all Indians, welfare for farmers and informal workers. And Ambedkar said no. Ambedkar wanted it to be limited to industrial workers. And Louise, has an interesting answer to this, that it potentially possibly had to do with Ambedkar's understanding that formal labor and formal employment in the urban economy would be the answer to Dalit struggles and to Dalit emancipation. And so he didn't want to, but also that the interests of the agrarian group would actually, upend all attempts to do social protection. That the agrarian elite are so strong that if you allow it to open up into this, you'd actually have so much opposition. We can ask Louise to discuss this some more. I think it's a very, very interesting question. So the answer then wasn't to extend social protection to the informal workers. What was it? It was to actually try to improve livelihoods, let's say, or incomes of the informal sector and of the agricultural sector through government support to agriculture. And so that's the Green Revolution story, and to create rural development schemes, right? So there's a whole range of different kinds of investments. And this is in under Nehru, that there's an investment in rural development. So urban industrial gets social protection. Rural India and agriculture needs to work, right? So that's the argument here, that we need to get them to work. But the interesting thing is, how do they work, right? And so there is this idea of socialism that you talk about, right? This Nehruvian socialism, but it's a socialism of self-help. So I found that very interesting. It's also really interesting because we haven't actually thought of Nehruvian socialism as sounding neoliberal. But self-help is the quintessential way in which we critique neoliberalism, right? And usually we don't think about Nehruvian socialism, where we think about the state's role as in any way neoliberal. But when you think about its obsession with self-help, the idea that for agriculture and for rural industry, for artisans, for informal workers. And the idea was that they would cooperatize, they would come into cooperatives, they would, work for themselves and decommodify labor by becoming the owners of, both capital and output. This is how I understood it. Now, this is very fascinating. And I think in some ways it tells you why it didn't work, right? So why did this not work? Why did this not work? And I think part of the reason it didn't work, and I would be very interested to hear what you think about it, but at least from the sounds of it, and definitely the way you describe it, part of the reason it didn't work is because actually that model of socialism, of self-help and decommodification didn't understand markets. It didn't understand commercialization. It didn't understand the degree to which both farmers, producers of all kinds, artisans and others, are tied up with economic arrangements which are full of markets, right? And there was no theory of market. And so you didn't also produce the kinds of public institutions, both regulatory as well as promotive. Right? Earlier we talked about the fact that we had regulation and promotion. India has historically liked to couple regulation and promotion together in many different acts, even though they have an interesting tension within that. But so we created, and I think, Louise, one thing that's slightly missing in this is that we didn't just have a philosophy of it or an idea, but there was also an investment in a set of institutions. Not just agricultural universities and the whole extension establishment, which you do talk about, but commodity boards, different kinds of regulatory institutions, public organizations which were created. You think about the handicraft board, handloom board. These were all 50s, 60s, 70s. There was a whole range of institutions that were supposed to help direct public investment. The same thing with the extension of credit. Right? Banking was critical to this, so, actually the extension of credit. Now, what happened to those institutions? Why was it just a combination of patronage and clientelism that, sunk them? How did they become hollowed out, right? And what we've actually seen in the last few years, especially in the last 5 years, this current government has been on a spree of rationalization of public organizations. And many of the organizations that they are rationalizing are organizations from that time. They are the organizations that supported or were supposed to or had the seeds of an imagination for this kind of decommodified rural kind of economy, different set of social arrangements, and they were never actually fully supported. So I think it's a very interesting dilemma to ask ourselves what happened, why did that go so wrong? Why did it have no imagination of actually existing economic arrangements, markets and other things? And what happened to the public organizations that were created during that time across the economy, which was supposed to do some of this work, both protective in the sense of regulatory protection, right? A lot of our regulatory legislation, certainly mandis, for example, are supposed to be protective of farmers' rights, right? Cooperatives as well. And how have they become reimagined? So the current government has a 10,000 farmer producer organization imagination, but it's no longer about decommodification. It's about FPOs functioning as aggregators for large-scale corporate capital, right? And so it's not a decommodified, owned engagement, but it's actually about creating organizations in the service of larger corporates, and that's a big change. And then, given that those organizations failed and hollowed out and that vision changed, we have the move to the current moment where over 50% of the agriculture budget is a cash transfer, 50% is PM Kisan, right? So from an imagination of investment in extension, investment in science, investment in credit, investment in infrastructure and all the rest of it, we've actually moved to 50% of the budget, actually now in a DBT. So the last point I want to make actually is about the urban, and in some ways it'll link also to employment, because the next chapter in that second thing is actually about Maharashtra and the employment guarantee, and sort of thinking about employment. And you talk about how urban, so social protection was industrial and urban, but yet it's underdeveloped compared to the number of schemes. So whenever you talk even today about urban social protection, and COVID was that classic moment where everybody was like, the urban is unprotected. So it's very interesting that ideas come from industrial urban. But today you have a situation where urban social protection is often weaker, much weaker, than the kind of support produced and provided to the rural. And in some ways, it makes me think during the same period, around the time you started investing so heavily in schemes for rural India, not necessarily social protection, but schemes for economic development, there was a different type of social contract for the urban and the rural. And it had to do with preventing migration. It had to do with keeping people in rural India. So the idea was, even with NREGA, so much of the discussion was about asset creation so that people would stay in rural India rather than move, right? And so you almost have the situation where the Indian state invests a huge amount of rural citizens, delivers it poorly, does it in incredibly poor ways, hollows out the institutions, has it all caught up in interests. It fails. We don't actually have that kind of agricultural growth, Kalai, for that reason, right? We don't have the kind of surplus-driven diversification from agriculture to the extent that we should have had. But when it fails and people leave the rural area, the state says, now we don't owe you much because you broke your end of the deal. We give you so much so that you stay. But once you move, we stop actually investing in you in the same way as we invest. So, the idea of how nascent urban programs are, given that they were historically so important, may have precisely to do with the kind of investment the state makes in trying to transform but fails in some senses. But where, which you described in Madhya Pradesh, where it does succeed, very different dynamics come, and we see different kinds of mobility. But and Madhya Pradesh is a good example potentially of where you could have gone if you actually had an imagination, right, for this economy. But even there, you fall short in finally delivering the kinds of public investment and public institutions that you need if you were to have a robust vision of decommodification that wasn't just about self-help. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you. I don't know whose idea it was to put me on the list. I'm guessing Louise had something to do with it. It's not the first time she's been generous in this way. I had the privilege of doing it in King's in 2016 with your previous book. So thank you for all these acts of generosity and for writing this book. So I thought actually, I want to start with a small tribute to a person completely unrelated to the theme of the conference. It's to David Lodge. He passed away recently, I think in the past 5 or 10 days. And the reason why I brought him up is because this is the first academic conference I'm attending since his passing. And his campus trilogy has been very important to me to keep my faith in academia and to take it with a pinch of salt, especially Small World, which is all about conferences. I don't know if you haven't read David Lodge, please read the campus trilogy. Okay, so reading this book was, I started very enthusiastically because I thought, here's a social policy person. But very quickly, I started feeling quite ill-suited to comment in a very sensibly, because even though the economists don't accept me necessarily as an economist, reading the book actually made me realize just how much of an economist I am, in fact, because so much of the literature is very new. And of course, we read about the Green Revolution in our courses. We read about NREGA, I work on NREGA, but we're all looking at it. I mean, the prism, the lens into these issues is very different. So it was, obviously I learned a lot. I already said how it was quite brave to take this on, and also, this is quite an ambitious book. And I think one of the biggest contributions will be that it will open up, hopefully, a whole new area of research on social policy in India. I'm always begrudging this, that LSE has a department of social policy with 50 odd faculty members, and all of India doesn't have a single department of social policy at any educational institution. And so in that sense, I think it's a very big contribution also, because a lot of what I have to say are book projects for you and others who might be interested in taking this up. So I learned a lot, obviously, and I also had to unlearn some things. And because I'm so finicky, I started doing some fact checking. Sorry. So it was quite, I just got totally into it, but that's partly why. No. So I'm supposed to comment on the third part of the book, which is post-liberalization, but actually it's not quite fitting into that template. It's partly because, a lot of this material is so new for me. But what I did pick up on, and I was really happy to be here for Atya's presentation this morning, which was on the famine codes, because in my head, this whole history of NREGA goes to the famine codes. It would be very hard to make a case to de-link. And of course, and Barbara commented on Atya's work also about whether we should rethink our interpretation of NREGA as a rights-based legislation and go back to the famine code, like what's happening there. And so, I guess many people already know that there were these famines, there were not just deaths, but also quite a lot of distress, rural distress. A lot of the deaths were caused by migration from rural areas to urban areas because people's livelihoods collapsed, and so they were coming to the cities. And so the famine codes then thought up this thing, which itself has a history in the UK, which is the poor laws and the poor houses that they had there. And it was really, in economics, there's a 1992 paper by Besley and Coate called Workfare versus Welfare. So they also latched onto this idea. And it's a very appealing idea for economists, right? That you want to do something for everyone, but you can't afford it. So what you do is you impose this work conditionality. And that automatically leads to some kind of self-selection. And even the famine codes had it, and even the poor laws have that, you make the conditions so bad that someone who's really desperate will only come and, work there and live there. And the initial, I think famine codes were also criticized a little bit because of this destitution. And I think that kind of thing didn't appear later, but in fact, it's always been there. It's a way of controlling costs when you think you can't afford to do, and if you give it free, just like social assistance, then you're going to get many more claimants. But if you restrict it or you link it with work, then you're likely to be able to keep it under control or manageable at least. Similarly, and actually, Louise does comment in her book about the famine codes, but I felt it was too cursory and perhaps that, if we're looking for continuities, which she does, then perhaps there was a need to delve a little bit more on that. And there is old work on these famine codes and India and the link with not just EGS, but even after that in the 1980s, in the 87-88 drought, if I remember correctly, Rajiv Gandhi was the prime minister. That part is correct, that he was the prime minister. But if I remember correctly, he actually went from state to state, and the drought relief works in the affected states, which included Gujarat, which is why it's such a vivid memory, and Rajasthan, and perhaps Maharashtra also. And it really became a political issue at that time. And again, I think that part of the history of these employment programs isn't really well covered. But like I said, this is, there's only that much you could have done. So that was one thing that I'm kind of familiar with. And of course, it was nice to see these links over a period of time. I thought that perhaps, again, this is something that Barbara was talking about, is how is the is the UPA period any different from what was happening before, right? This sort of rights-based legislation stuff, is it really different? Were the dynamics, the political compulsions, were they any different? And I think a lot of these moves were basically like, they felt like they had their backs against the wall, so they have to do something. Otherwise, in the case of the PDS, also, I had some questions and kind of, again, because I'm not very familiar. So the first emergence or whatever appearance of the PDS is in the Second World War. Again, and then that becomes, it was very much an urban intervention at that time. What does happen with the Green Revolution is that there is this need to start thinking of it even as an rural intervention, yes. But procurement really doesn't. So there are, like I was telling Louise already, that there are two kind of causes for the PDS becoming a bigger network or expanding the PDS network. One is that the Green Revolution makes it a political compulsion because traditional patron-client relationships are weakening. There's a rise of agrarian capitalists, there's poverty, inequality, so you have to do this. But I think later on in the book, she also says that, in fact, this is one way of utilizing the surplus that you are buying from farmers, right? And I think that one has it appeals to me much more because it also fits with the data much more. So I think the real big jump in procurement starts happening in the 90s. Until then, the procurement levels are still, they are rising, obviously, but, the scale of it just balloons after that. And then it really becomes like, okay, what do you do with this? So it's not so much so it's the timing, I think, and the expansion and perhaps even the motivation for it. Then I have this other point, which I don't really know that. Yeah, sure. Which is this labor laws. And I think in your kind of scheme of things, they do play an important role. And this IDA, Chapter 5 or whatever, Chapter 4 or 6B, whatever it is. But there is quite a lot of literature in economics on, like Aditya Bhattacharya has this paper where he questions the Besleyan-Burgess interpretation of the labor laws and their impact on hiring, etc. I'm not sure, again, this is not a literature I know that much, but in the end, I think they were not that important as they were made out to be as a result of the Besleyan-Burgess paper, which became really, it's interesting why certain papers and their results find so much traction, even though they're perhaps flawed in some of their... I'm not saying it, Adibat said it. Okay, so then, so then this is again something I already told her. I think the regional dimensions you should bring in more in the next edition of the book. It's all there for you. And because in my own understanding, I think they influence the national schema of things quite a bit, right? What becomes a national scheme, in a sense, it helps to have these success stories or templates at the state level. And then what tends to happen is one does it, then another. So then by the time it becomes a national scheme, you already have 5 or 6. So you feel confident to be able to scale it up. And I think that part somehow, because you did the previous book, you thought maybe, but maybe in the next edition, bring it back. And then in the liberalization story, I was wondering if, it's true. I mean, all these documents from the World Bank that have been declassified, etc., which show how the Indian government was actually lobbying for a continuation of the PDS. But in fact, that's the period when this BPL, APL started, which we find super problematic, right? Which really undermined the PDS in an important way, the functioning of the PDS in an important way. So yes, there was some negotiation and pushback, and I think that part, of course, is true. But there was also at this end, trying to undermine it through APL, BPL targeting, first through the revamp PDS, and then much more so. Actually, revamp was not so problematic as targeted PDS, perhaps. Another thing for the next book, again, I feel like, at certain points, certain people play a very important role, and it's just like tukka, as we say. It's just fluke. But I felt like that part, if it could be woven in at some, or it could be a separate book project, is who were these people? Like very early on, when you're talking about the ILO and ESI, there was an India representative at the ILO. And it would be interesting to know who this person was, what his or her background is, because I think these things also kind of, and then again, I think during UPA 1 and UPA 1, perhaps more than UPA 2, the people in the in the Congress party who wielded power at that time, I think they perhaps did have, it was tukka that they were there, but in fact their being there did nudge the thing in a particular direction. One very specific example of this is when the NREGA bill when the Congress came with the first NREGA bill, they wanted it to be only for BPL households. Right? And then, of course, all of us were shouting and whatever. But then I think it was the chairperson of the UPA who put her foot down, and, then the Congress kind of fell in line a little bit. I'm not exactly sure if I'm getting it right, but there's a paper by Jean in the Nirja Jal and Pratap Bhanu Mehta, big fat book, whatever, which might be interesting. So I think that was more or less it. There were my fact checks, which I'll talk to you about later. There were last one or two small things. You're right. And then the main one big thing. So the mention of IDs. You mentioned it in the context of how when they were going to a targeted PDS, they wanted to bring a national ID so that in people's minds, PDS benefits and the IDs could be delinked, because ration card even today in so many states is so important as an ID document. And of course, because of my work on Aadhaar, I totally latched on to that. They've been trying to do this for very long. And then the other thing was to, if this mention of these schemes that we talk about now as direct benefits, because now the PDS is not described as a direct benefit. NREG is not described as a direct benefit. Midday meals, ICDS is not a direct benefit according to the popular understanding today. Popular understanding today of direct benefits is to give cash. So if at that time, the things that we work on, were at that time seen as direct benefits, I think that would be quite interesting to write about for a popular piece. And then finally, the thing that I wanted to say is, which is not so much about the book, but just generally about social policy issues and welfare regimes or the welfare state. And again, this came up to me in the morning when Hussain was presenting his paper, where he was talking about social housing. Like, why don't we talk about social housing? What do we include in the, where's this line drawn, and what does the welfare state look like? What should it look like? I mean, in the UK case, it helps because of the Beveridge report, right? He kind of put a framework. And I think even in my head, because of that Timmins book, The Five Giants, there's that framework, right? But if we just start to think about it in the Indian context, what do you include and what do you not include? And it's a question for all of this literature, not necessarily for this book, is what should be the welfare state. We know certain things are definitely in, but why don't we talk about some other things? Like housing never gets talked, or hardly ever gets talked about in the context of social policy in India, even though, as Hussain's work was showing very clearly, it's so important. So congratulations and thank you for giving us this nice homework.
Maybe we'll circulate to the audience for 2 or 3 questions. I see some hands up already. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to throw one little question in the mix, which is something, in fact, Reetika and I have discussed. In the discourse, this beverage incident is fascinating. So not to make it too much about the sort of personality of Ambedkar, but at the time, was there, in the discourse, were there more universalists sort of ideas circulating? That then, of course, got defeated because social economic rights got, as you say, downgraded, or as Jalal says, downgraded to the directive principles. But was there an Indian beverage or Indian beverages in circulation or not? And if so, what did they say? Okay, sorry. Hands. I have Sebastian, Zain, and Professor Bardhan in the first round.
Now, I just have 4 very small points to Louise. All of them probably to the first part of your book, all historical. I presume you've talked about the Indian participation in the ILO convention, but have you looked into, and this is, I'm asking just because I'm ignorant, in 1948, there's a United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. If you read that, one of those human rights was social security. Every person has a right to have social security. And I was wondering, Indians were apparently the Indian government was an enthusiastic participant of that United Nations Charter, were they signing on to universal social security at that time? And was there any discussion in India? So that's my first historical question. Second question, you refer to the Nehru Mahalanobis approach, etc. I, as a young student in Kolkata at that time, read an article written by Mahalanobis signifying to me that he was thinking about social protection of labor. He has a paper suggesting, I'm sure there was no taker for that, but while he was framing the second 5-year plan, he was also thinking about what to do when a worker loses a job. And he has a scheme of what he called a labor reserve. So if a person loses a job, doesn't lose the income, he or she is put in the labor reserve for a time. I'm sure at bare pittance, but so that they can be brought back some other time. It's a form of unemployment insurance, but he didn't call it that. So there is an article that Mahalanobis wrote around that time. So he did think about that part. Third issue is, in any part of the historical discussion, particularly you also mentioned that the capitalists, Indian businessmen, were thinking of social policy right from the beginning. In that discussion, was universal benefit ever brought in? And the reason I'm thinking of it, one of the historical interesting parts of Western, particularly Northwestern welfare state, say Scandinavian countries, was businessmen were quite enthusiastic about the welfare state. Why? Because then they don't themselves have to provide anything. The state will provide, so that health and other benefits, they don't have to worry about it. Unlike the US businessmen, because they have to pay something to for the workers' health benefit. If the state pays for it from the taxpayer money, then individual businessmen don't have to worry about it. So they were in favor of universal benefits. So I was wondering if any part of the business support for social policy, universality was ever considered. The last point that I want to make, again historical, do you think in India, for various historical reasons, this preoccupation of doing something for the poor by reservation of jobs is one form of, very indirect form of security. Do you think that diverted attention, this preoccupation with job reservation for certain caste groups, poor people, did it divert the discussion from the general welfare state discussion? Those are my 4 points.
Thank you, Louise, for what looks like a really exciting book. I just have 2 questions, again, to deal with the first part of your book. So I understand, the argument about going from sort of the Bombay story and the Bombay textile story and how that kind of charts out this welfare story. But what if you thought about it from the perspective of sort of the largest public sector workforce? So you start with the Indian Railways and think from there about welfare. Because, 2 things come to mind. One is that the Indian Railways has its own medical service. So Indian Railway workers don't go to ESI hospitals, they go to Indian Railway Medical Service hospitals and dispensaries and so on. So you have maybe different welfare regimes emerging even within the public sector workforce. And the second one is that to this day, railway workers are part of have elections to all sorts of boards which have to do with welfare. For example, with housing, right? Or again with the medical service. So there are actually elections still involved. And when you think about that and you think about the trade unions, again, that question comes in of whether welfare is being used. This is the way that I would look at it. You may not agree, but that trade unions are being integrated into a sort of welfare regime. And I think that relates to the question that you talked about briefly, which was, I understand your argument that the Indian business had their own reasons for promoting welfare to stop this sort of race to the bottom. But then still, how exactly does this welfare and the elaboration of this welfare regime relate to perhaps the most vibrant decade of sort of labor strikes in Indian history? There still is some relation because it's the same regime which is bringing their welfare policies, but also breaking strikes and also setting up, what Ravi Ahuja says is a very authoritarian industrial relations regime. So I think there's still the question of what is that relation, even if it's not sort of the determining factor.
This is absolutely fascinating. So thank you very, very much. I don't have any points. I have 2 very specific questions. I got fascinated by your observation of business having its own interest in workers' welfare, naturally. And the 2 questions are, unless one embraces a very childish version of Marxism, we know that capacity and interests of the classes vary across countries, times, subnational contexts, and so on. So the question, given the observation you make, the first question is, under what conditions do the industrialists, what does the 10 years of data collection or looking at archives told you, under what conditions do industrialists care about things other than short-run profit maximization, which are maybe intertemporal maximization subject to constraints, including quality of labor, whatever. Under what conditions do industrialists care about things other than short-term maximization? And then the second related question, which I'm sure is not in the book, and it's out of curiosity, whether you found other areas other than social policy in which industrialists, as you call them, did also develop interests other than their own myopic one. That is, would there be evidence of this sort of short-term perspective or more universal perspective in other areas? Because that would add evidence to whatever the first point that you made.
I really look forward to reading your book. There's a bit I've been working on, and it's more related to how the IDA developed and progressed over the years. And it seems that every time the IDA was modified, let's say with 5A, it was preparing for some big change. So be it 5A or then Section 5B in 76, or the amendment of 5B in 82, it was in anticipation of some broader market reforms. And then after that, there haven't been any major changes. But there's this, as Professor Nagaraj would say, that there's this de jure versus the de facto that sort of emerges in the 2000s, late 90s, 2000s. Does your book cover some of that?
Thanks. That's a full slate, Louise. So feel free to take whatever part of
Thanks.
it you like. Yeah.
I think I've made my task more difficult by taking questions. So I won't be able to do justice to everything, but thank you all so much for such a rich set of comments. Anush and Pranab, maybe I'll start with you, and Sebastian to some extent, on visions of universalism. The Ambedkar beverage moment is possibly my favourite bit of the book, and I was only mildly disappointed that Ravi Ahuja pipped me to the post. He'd been working on the set with the same material, so he has a piece on the beverage plan for India as well, but doesn't address the point which I think is most interesting, which is why Ambedkar ditched the invitation to Beveridge, which had got really far. Beveridge was really keen to come. He was born in India. I didn't know this. Parents are both, father had worked for the Indian Civil Service. But he was insistent that if I had a clean slate to think about freedom from want in India, I wouldn't start with social security for industrial labour. I would start, actually where he wanted to start was agricultural productivity. We think, there was a series of BBC interviews where he kind of made reference to this. But Ambedkar says, no, you can't come and have a clean slate. And the visit gets called off. And there's not very much more in the archives. I mean, I have looked everywhere I could to find further explanation. But I think, as Mekhala summarised, my hunch is that he was being expedient, that he was member for Labour on the VEC. He had a moment to do something for industrial labour. Of course, he had his own, experience of labour organisation in Bombay as well, and was part of those evolving debates in Bombay. So I think this was partly expedience. He knew that if Beveridge cast a wider canvas, then that momentum might be lost. And if you started to think about... And there were people who tried to do this. So I think the Madras presidency, for instance, said, we don't like the idea of... So if we're going to think about sickness insurance, we have to think about sickness insurance for the rural population as well as, as industrial workers. There were, I mean, I don't want to overstate those ideas, but there were some, certainly. But I think Ambedkar was in part being expedient. But an expedience, I think, which had tremendous consequence, not only for, if you like, the death of the universalist idea at the point of its inception, but also particularly for debates about the development of India's health service. So what happens is that ESI, the Employees' State Insurance legislation, is passed in 1948, before the Bohor Committee has finished its deliberations. And people involved in the Bohor report said, what is this idea? We haven't even really been involved in discussing, a kind of medical system for industrial labour. So I part of what I say in the book is that moment where you might have a more universalist idea emerging is kind of cut off at its inception. Interestingly, though, one of the only amendments to the sickness insurance legislation was to amend it to make it extendable to other categories of labour. And that was used in Tamil Nadu, I can't remember when, part of the 1990s, I think, social policy legislation for the informal sector. Which brings me on to Pranab. So I talk about that very same Mekhala Nobis piece on the Labour Reserve Service. Although he published that when he'd stepped down from the Planning Commission. And of course, they never actually implemented it. But there certainly was thinking about what do you do with unemployed the urban educated unemployment problem. And then that's kind of folded into debates about whether, and there was, the Planning Commission files on possible unemployment insurance legislation, several iterations of what that might have looked like, but they'd never come to pass. On the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, my colleague at King's, Nidra Gopal Jayal, is currently working on a book on Hansa Mehta's role in framing that. So I might punt your question to her. But my gut instinct would be to say that India was not signing up to a more universalist conception of social security. They would have had the more limited understanding of social security that Ambedkar did, i.e. it's what they were already doing. Rather than something more expansive that one day might be, extended to other categories of labour. On the role of several questions on the role of business, and under what conditions do industrialists care about things? So one thing I should say is that I don't want to overstate, and I don't think I do in the book, overstate the extent to which it was industrialists who were pushing for social policy. The intervention I'm trying to make, and for those of you who know this literature well, is particularly in response to some of the arguments, for instance, that Vivek Chibber makes in Locked in Place, which is to say that industrialists were steadfastly opposed to anything that addressed workers' poverty and workers' rights. To cut a kind of long story short there, Chibber is particularly looking at Bengal capital when he makes that argument, which is steadfastly opposed to the kinds of social security initiatives I'm talking about. The conditions under which industrialists favoured a state role in coordinating this kind of labour legislation was indeed to protect particular kinds of business interests, particularly in a place like Bombay, which was being in which labour costs were rising, and where industrialists realised that some form of social policy, or the provincial government was trying to introduce some form of social policy that would have placed costs on employers, and if employers in one region were to bear those costs, they wanted those labour costs also exported to other regions. So that's the kind of intervention I'm trying to make. There. Zain, on your point about how the development of these ideas about social policy related to the hostile industrial relations regime, they were absolutely hand in fist. And that's, you could make that same argument about the kind of the consolidation of the industrial relations regime after independence as well. So you have, on the one hand, hostile interventions around in response to labour mobilisation. At the same time, the provincial government is also looking at what other kinds of policies might be useful to stabilise the factory workforce and to deal with absenteeism driven by ill health. Your first question and some of the other questions as well are also around how do you draw the limits around what is welfare, or where would you start? And you'd asked why, if we started with other parts of the public sector, we could tell a different story about welfare. And all the way through researching and writing this book, I constantly, what about X? What about Y? I don't talk about, for instance, the social policy development for government employees, which is also developed earlier than the story I tell here on industrial policy. And these are really crucial. I think all of you in different ways raise this question. What I'm trying to do in this book is to go a little way in thinking about what kind of welfare regime does India have. But these are really profound questions about what you include in that conceptualization. And by no means do I think this book is the final word, but I hope it's part of a conversation that might grow around it.
Congratulations again, Louise, on the book. I mean, I'm sure it's been a huge endeavor, and we all look forward to going through it.